Thank you, Deputy President. I seek leave to make the Greens budget reply speech.
Is leave granted? There being no objection, leave is granted. Senator McKinnon.
Thanks, Deputy President. This budget has been delivered in truly exceptional circumstances. We're in the middle of a global pandemic that has hit us hard. But the pandemic has also exposed many pre-existing fault lines in our economy and in our society. Insecure work, poverty, privatisation, social isolation and underfunded public services. These times and this budget may well be defined by a global pandemic. But even before any of us had heard of COVID-19, we had massive challenges facing us, and those challenges remain today. The Earth's climate is breaking down around us. We are living through a mass extinction event. Nature is being destroyed at record pace. The ecological systems that our economy and our society rely on are in crisis. And in economic terms, we are also in exceptional circumstances. Interest rates are at the lowest rate in the history of the Federation. Globally, interest rates are at the lowest level in recorded human history. Borrowing money has never been cheaper. Australian households are now carrying more debt than they ever have, and Australia's level of household debt is second in the world only to Switzerland. Yet despite people borrowing more money than ever, cheaper than ever, home ownership rates are going through the floor. And in Australia, home ownership rates are now back to where they were in the 1950s. And this is not because people don't want to earn money. Workforce participation is at the highest rate it's ever been. More people than ever are putting their hands up for a job. But wages growth is at the lowest rate that it's been since the Australian Bureau of Statistics started keeping records on it in the 1950s. So we've got wage growth at record lows, but we've got the proportion of national income going to company profits at record highs. The end result of all this is that wealth inequality is entrenched, it's significant and it's rising. Record low interest rates, record high household debt, falling home ownership, record workforce participation, record low wages growth, record high company profits, rising wealth inequality. This is what we faced before we entered a global pandemic, and this is what 40-odd years of naked neoliberalism has delivered. More and more people are getting less and less despite making a greater and greater effort. Meanwhile, the big corporations and the super wealthy who own and run them sit back and pocket ever bigger profits and amass ever greater wealth. Neoliberalism rewards wealth more than it rewards effort. It is a system where the rent-seekers rule. It's a system that, instead of repaying the biggest workforce in our country's history with the standard of public infrastructure and public services that a prosperous nation such as ours should share and enjoy, has privatised and deregulated. It's a system that's created gouging monopolies that pay exorbitant dividends to the wealthy few and at the same time force millions of Australians to take on paralysing levels of private debt just to keep their heads above the water. This is a system where, if you're not amongst the chosen few, you must, to paraphrase Lewis Carroll, run as fast as you can just to stay in place, and to go anywhere, run twice as fast as that. This is a system where the game is rigged. Undoubtedly, COVID-19 is the trigger for the recession that we're in. But this recession and the pathway to recovery will be made monstrously more difficult for the vast majority of Australians because of the 4 decades-long neoliberal assault on the spirit of our country. Privatised public utilities, outsourced public services, a mad obsession with budget surpluses, a deregulated industrial relations system, a deregulated financial sector, trade deals that diminish the sovereignty of our country, manufacturing forced offshore, a property market rigged in favour of the speculators, and massive tax breaks for miners and polluters who are pillaging our common wealth and cooking the planet. All of these have been deliberate policy choices of successive Australian governments, starting with the Labor Party under Hawke and Keating and supercharged under the Liberals. They have chipped away at the social fabric of our country. They've rewarded the individual at the expense of the collective. They've rewarded capital at the expense of labour. They've wound back the clock on much of the progress that was made in the middle of the last century towards a more equal society and a more shared prosperity. Thanks to neoliberalism, we entered the pandemic with an underfunded healthcare system, with an underfunded and privatised childcare system, with an underfunded, privatised and barely regulated aged care system, with an underfunded education and training system, with 40% of our workforce in insecure work, with entrenched high rates of unemployment and underemployment, with a social safety net set below what people need to survive, and with the most overpriced housing in the world. The pretence of more competition and more choice, delivering some kind of market nirvana for people, was always a con. Neoliberalism has done to this country what it was always going to do: concentrate wealth and widen the divide between the haves and the have-nots. And all of this has been facilitated by the 2 major parties that sit in this place today and by an all-powerful financial industry, which is a rapacious parasite on our country that has hollowed out the real economy and left behind nothing but a fragile shell. This is why the cheapest money in history is no longer enough. We are truly through the looking glass. So in the face of all this, we've got this year's budget. So how does it stack up? Is it a turning point? Is it a not-since-wartime budget? Is it a whatever-it-takes budget? A budget that builds a nation? A budget that gives hope to people? Is it a budget that offers us that hope that we so desperately need, that we can live good lives and respect nature and climate? No. Of course it's not. Not from this Prime Minister, not from this Treasurer, not from this government. This budget is a neoliberal train wreck that will impoverish poor people, steal hopes and dreams from young people, that will entrench wealth inequality, will entrench unemployment and underemployment and line the pockets of the big corporates and the super rich. Don't believe the government's budget hype. This budget does nothing to change the structure of the Australian economy or the underlying social and human and natural problems this structure has created. It perpetuates the same old, failed, trickle-down, crony capitalist, fake economics rubbish that is simply about big corporations and the super rich gorging themselves on the hard work of others and rigging the rules to suit themselves. The only difference this time is that it's neoliberalism on tick. But don't be fooled by a newfound tolerance for government debt, because this budget seeks to protect and project the same old neoliberal ideas. The government could have used this budget and increased the debt to invest in a shared future, providing the infrastructure, the income support, the jobs and the public services needed to create a cleaner, fairer and more equitable future. It could have used the debt to create jobs in renewable energy, reforesting and rewilding, helping reduce emissions, restore ecosystems and draw down carbon from our atmosphere. But instead, it chose to use the debt to further rig the system so that the big corporates and the super rich can keep making off like bandits, while millions of Australians will endure the kind of hardship and poverty that nobody, and I mean nobody, in a nation as rich as ours should ever have to suffer. Hardship and poverty that will scar for a lifetime. Hardship and poverty that is a stain on our country's history. This is a bloody great budget for coal companies and gas companies. It's a magnificent budget for the banks. It's a bonanza for the arms manufacturers. This is a budget for the government's mates. It's a budget by the government's mates. It's a budget for the government's mates. And boy, does this budget deliver for the government's mates and for the government's political donors. But if you're a young person, if you're renting, if you're a woman, if you're a First Nations person, if you're unemployed, if you're underemployed, if you're struggling to pay the bills, if you're worried about the climate crisis, if you're worried about the biodiversity crisis, this is not a budget that offers you the hope that you so desperately need. This budget continues to ignore women. There is no new money to make childcare accessible. There is no new money to build affordable public housing, and there is no new money to fund frontline domestic violence services, despite 37 women having been killed by violence already this year and rates of domestic violence having increased since the start of the pandemic. And its main selling point, tax cuts, will deliver twice as much money to men as they will to women. People working in arts and entertainment were some of the first to be hit by the social distancing requirements. The sector has suffered tremendously through the lockdown and will be one of the last to recover. And it's a sector that gives so much spirit to life in this country. Yet the Treasurer could not even find it within himself to utter the word art in his budget speech earlier this week. Arts and entertainment workers were largely excluded from JobKeeper, and many are now faced with trying to survive on $40 a day on JobSeeker. Clearly, the $112 billion a year arts and entertainment sector does not matter to the Morrison government. And universities have been literally decimated by this crisis. A full 10% plus of their workforce is gone. And what's the government's response? Slash support, deliberately and on multiple occasions exclude them from JobKeeper and massively hike the price of getting a degree. There's no new money in this budget for environment conservation and effectively nothing to help protect our threatened natural species and natural ecosystems in the middle of the 6th great mass extinction event in our planet's history. There's no serious action to close the gap, a shameful betrayal of promises made just 4 months ago. Meanwhile, the surveillance state will continue to grow, our rights and liberties will be further eroded and more power concentrated into the dangerous hands of the Department of Home Affairs. This budget also turns Australia's back on the world's displaced people. It cuts Australia's humanitarian intake, our refugee intake, by 20,000 places over the next 4 years. What is happening to this country? This budget gouges almost $1 billion of support for refugees and people seeking asylum and gives it straight to the big corporates and the super wealthy in tax breaks, and $99 billion every year in corporate welfare. And with more than a dash of good old-fashioned xenophobia and racism, this budget shamefully introduces an English language dictation test for partner visas. I'm hearing echoes of the White Australia policy. There is no funding in this budget for the desperately needed federal anti-corruption watchdog, and the Liberals, of course, have taken revenge on the National Audit Office for exposing sports rorts by slashing its funding. The centrepiece of this budget is the bringing forward of the Stage 2 tax cuts, supported by the Australian Labor Party. That will see millionaires get $2,500 a year extra in their pockets, the working poor get $250 a year in their pockets, and the unemployed can line up for their regular kick in the teeth, because they will get nothing, because a tax cut is worth nothing to you if you haven't got a job. Don't be fooled by the spin. The additional offset for low and middle income earners is a one-off. It'll be gone in a year's time. There's a temporary boost for the millions and a permanent boost for the millionaires. And Stage 3, which will arrive in 4 years' time, unless it's brought forward in the meantime, is even worse. By that point, the top 10% will be getting 50% of the additional benefit. Stage 3 was voted for by both major parties in this place when it was legislated. And under both Stage 2 and Stage 3 of these tax cuts that overwhelmingly benefit high-income earners, men get twice the benefit that women get. These tax cuts will further entrench gender inequality and further disrespect the massive contribution that women have made and continue to make to our country. Borrowing money to give the wealthiest Australians a tax cut is obviously patently unfair. But it's also really bad economics. There is nothing Keynesian about using the public purse to enrich the already very wealthy. There is nothing smart about tax cuts that leave behind young people, unemployed people and women. These tax cuts will not create jobs. These tax cuts will not trickle down. These tax cuts will not work. And how do we know they won't work? Well, we tried them last year and they didn't work. So last year, when increased tax offsets landed in people's bank accounts, household incomes rose by the highest rate in a decade. But in the same quarter, household consumption grew by what was then the lowest rate in a decade. Even before we were in recession, people were saving. They weren't spending because the economy was already stretched to breaking points, as was so many household budgets. And now that we're in the middle of the greatest economic downturn since the Great Depression, people will obviously do the same again and more. And you know what? Fair enough too. In the face of insecure work, low wage growth, high levels of household debt, high unemployment, massive underemployment, it's the natural thing to do. The point is, tax cuts won't do what the major parties say they are going to do. The money will not make its way out into the economy. They simply will not work. And we know that trickle-down economics is one of the world's great political cons. The people at the bottom are dying of thirst, waiting for a few drops to reach them. If low and middle income earners weren't spending before COVID hit and weren't spending before we got into a recession, then high income earners certainly won't be spending in the middle of a recession. What will happen is that high-income earners will accumulate yet more wealth by buying more shares or paying off the mortgage on their investment property. It's also worth remembering that this is the third consecutive budget where this government has put forward some version of these tax cuts, going further and faster every time. The first two times around, it was the magical impending surplus, which didn't last long, mind you, that supposedly enabled the tax cuts. Third time around, not a surplus in sight, and yet here are the tax cuts again. And what this shows is that these tax cuts are ideological, pure and simple. Surplus or no surplus, pandemic or no pandemic, deficit or no deficit, debt or no debt, this government is always going to let the wealthy accumulate more wealth. And here's a newsflash for you. Tax cuts are of absolutely no benefit if you don't have a job. Instead of giving tax cuts for millionaires, we should be helping the millions of Australians who are unemployed and underemployed. JobSeeker must be permanently increased so people, all people, can live a dignified life. Money given to people that need it is not only the right thing to do, it is money that will get spent in our economy. If this government cared about its people and cared about the state of the economy, this budget would make sure that those who this government seems content to confine to joblessness have a chance to live with some dignity. But this government isn't content just with helping out the millionaires and the super rich. This budget also extends $99 billion a year in corporate welfare. It doesn't matter to the government that companies in Australia are already extracting record profits. It doesn't matter that the share market has already recovered most of its losses. It doesn't matter that 1 in 3 of the biggest corporations in this country pay absolutely zero tax at all. It doesn't matter because apparently the big corporations need yet more corporate welfare, yet more help from the public purse. Liberal mates, Liberal donors. And what of the climate emergency? This government would rather the country burn than upset the most favoured of Liberal donors, the fossil fuel industry. The so-called gas-led recovery is nothing other than an abomination. It's been designed by hand-picked gas company executives who want to turn our country into a petro-state. The International Energy Agency has spelt out there is no room for any new carbon-emitting energy source if the Paris targets are to be met. But this government could not care less. We're not headed, colleagues, for a gas-led recovery. We are just being gaslit. That's what's going on in this budget. Now, budgets are about choices, and these choices that are made in budgets reflect a government's priorities. Well, the Australian Greens reject this government's choices and its priorities. We reject neoliberalism in whatever form it comes. The Australian Greens want to build an economy that works for people, not the other way around. We want to build an economy that respects nature, that respects our ecosystems and respects our climate, and doesn't see our climate and our natural places merely as resources to be dug up and burned and profited from, or as dumping grounds for toxic chemicals, carbon and pollutants. If we can remake our society to protect us from a virus, we can remake it to look after everyone, to look after climate and to look after nature. The Greens plan responds to the magnitude of the challenges we face and the 3 intersecting crises: the pandemic, rising wealth inequality and the climate and biodiversity emergency. This is a choice that our parliament can make. Our plan is built around a government-backed jobs and income guarantee. That would ensure that everyone has an income that they need to live with dignity, and it will also get us back to full employment as quickly as possible. No one should get left behind, and the Greens plan ensures that no one will be. That is a choice that this parliament can make. Our plan is built around massive government investment in health, in education, in public and active transport, in the whole range of public services that people need and want and delivered at a high quality. It's built around massive investment in manufacturing and renewable energy, far beyond that which is included in the government's budget. These will be the building blocks of a fairer and cleaner economy. We can't afford not to do this. And this is a choice that our parliament can make. Our plan is built around our Create Australia strategy, a jobs-rich plan for the creative industries in our country, underpinned by a commitment to get artists into our schools and libraries, a decent kickstart to get more Australian content onto our screens, and live performances back to our stages. And this is a choice that our parliament can make. And for young people who, as with all recessions, are copping the brunt of it, our plan is built around a next-gen guarantee, free education, a living income and a guaranteed decent job if you want it. Our nation's future depends on trusting in and believing in the next generation, and this is a choice that our parliament can make. With the money that this budget commits to tax cuts, we can have a green recovery that creates hundreds of thousands of good, decent and well-paid jobs, ensures everyone has an income they can live on, and creates a clean, strong and stable economy. We can set everyone up to live a good and dignified life while we respect nature and our planet's climate. A plan to do this is not just possible, it's necessary. And this is a choice that our parliament can make. I'll sign off with a quote from David Attenborough, made only hours ago. He said this: "Nature will flourish when those that have a great deal perhaps have a little less." Thanks, David. The Greens couldn't agree more.
Senator Patrick.
Thank you, Madam Acting